know, my mother died Easter Sunday evening, and funeral is Thursday at 10 o'clock at St. Patrick's. I just wanted to say a word of thanks for people for all the prayers and the support. We're having, tonight is the beginning of a series. It's called Controversial Issues. And we have a great series, I believe. Dr. Glardy, who I saw walked in, will be figuring out if the Pope has any future or something like that. No, it's not exactly what he's talking about. It sounds interesting, though. And Don Cousins, who people know, writing a lot on the priesthood these days, will be here. So it's designed to be controversial, and we hope it is. Tonight I'm talking about is the theology of Karl Rahner outdated? I presume there's not too many people who've come in expect me to say yes to that. Be my presupposition anyway. We wrestled a lot with the title and weren't entirely thrilled with it. It turned people off, as I was worried it would. A priest friend of mine said he's coming to all the other lectures, but he's going to skip this one because it sounds so abstract and speculative. And my sister said she was thinking of coming to the lecture, and she said, well, what's the title? And I told her, and she says, well, I do have to wash my hair this evening. So... And then there was a group that came from Michigan, was coming from Michigan, and didn't want to drive all this way unless they were sure it was really going to be meaningful. And I said, I will for sure make this interesting. Not having the slightest idea of how I would do that. And trusting in the Spirit, that the Spirit would help in some way. So we're talking about Karl Rahner. Rahner's important. He's on one of the figures facing the baptismal font. He's the happy-looking fellow on this side. Well, not really. Pretty grim a lot of the times. Sober realist, as we like to say. But we're talking about somebody who's really important. David Tracy says one of the 4 or 5 most influential theologians in the whole history of the Catholic Church. And I tend to agree with that, dealing with an extremely important theologian and one worth considering. We'll talk more about him and who he is and so on. That's one of the persons who didn't think they wanted to come, said, well, you'd have to know too much about Rahner to know this. And I said, well, I'll find a way to make him intelligible, and even if people who don't have a lot of background will be able to figure out how this is important. Well, one of the ways we all recognize is important, or he is important, is because of his decisive influence on the Second Vatican Council, which in turn ends up influencing us. And there are many people who know Rahner's thought who never heard of him. When he died in 1984, I wrote an article for National Catholic Reporter saying that the world had lost the great interpreter of human experience, and that all of us were enriched by him, and even those who never heard his name, because much of his thought is filtered into the mind and heart of the Church. I once told Rahner that you're very influential in the United States. He says, I am. And I tried to explain to him how I thought that, explaining something to Rahner is not easy. I mean, when you're talking to a genius, you don't really run in there and say, well, let me explain this to you, Father. So I didn't really say it that way, but I tried to tell him the ways that I thought his thought filtered into the United States. Well, as we turn the centuries, I said, now we find, after a long period where Rahner sort of had a free pass and not many people criticized him and quoted him, and a lot of people never criticized him because they couldn't understand what he was saying. Now, as we begin the new century, we actually have quite a few critics who have come forward, and I hope to try to respond to some of those. But the point, I think, of all this in practical terms is that keeping Rahner alive is important for our own life and spirituality as Catholics in the new millennium. If Rahner gets shut out, something important will be lost in the Church. And there's all kinds of important things that he was about, and it become part of the way we live that we have to try to hang on to. So it's got practical ramifications. I suggest here one of the questions is, will the priesthood be open to women and married men? Will we really promote ecumenical and interfaith dialogue? Will we try to play up the role of the laity, or will we try to return to a more clericalized church? Will we try to reform the liturgical reform that was given to us by Vatican II? Those are big issues. I mean, it's got big effect on us. It's not just a speculative question at all, as my priest friend thought, but it's extremely practical for how we live our lives, Catholics and others as well, how we interact in this culture of ours. So I want to say a little bit about Rahner. He born 1904, died in 1984. And I suppose the most significant thing for us here is his great influence on the Second Vatican Council. Now that influence is not easy to trace, really. It's not so blatant as he just came in and told the council all of his theology and they put it into the documents. But one of the ways he was extremely influential was because of his influence on the German Bishops' Conference. In other words, the conferences of bishops, when they were over there in Rome in the 60s, some people here, this is ancient history, but there was a council back in 1962 to 65, Cheryl, and it was before you were born, but it was very important to some of us. We actually lived through it and read press reports about it on a day-to-day basis. So, and Rahner was, the bishops would meet and so on, and Rahner was very influential on the German Bishops' Conference, and also he was on various committees and commissions. So I think it is true to say that he was extremely influential on the Second Vatican Council, and surely it enshrines many of the things that he fought for, struggled for, and so on. Rahner was an interesting man. I mean, being in his presence was in the presence of genius. I got to spend time with him in Munich. I was doing my dissertation at Oxford on him, and I got time to go to Munich and be with him, and I ate meals with him and took walks with him, and was in his apartment and interacted. He wrote a wonderful introduction to the book I wrote about him. He was very good to me, very kind. I mean, I wouldn't call him, like a close personal friend, but I did interact with him, and it was one of the great privileges of my whole life. To be in his presence was to feel the energy. I mean, he had energy. He was a chain smoker. And he never learned to drive a car, but he'd get the young Jesuits, his Jesuit priest, get the young Jesuits to drive him. And he'd say, go faster, faster. And they'd be on a hill, and he said, pass it, pass the truck, pass it. Sort of lived on the edge. I was with him when he wrote the introduction to my book about him, and he paced the floor, and he had these big scissors in his hands, and he was scratching his back, and he's trying to smoke, and just bomb. And then he was all mad. The guy, there was a secretary there, a young Irish seminarian, and he was trying to get it down, and he wasn't getting it right, and volatile man. Just the energy exuded from him. I'd watch him come in the library. I read not only his published works, but his unpublished stuff, his class notes and everything. It's in the library in Munich at Berkman's College. And he would come in the library and he'd pick up a journal off the wall and he'd start to page through it. And he would just go about that fast. You had the feeling he was assimilating everything in there. Now and then, he would get to an article and he would sit down at a table and he would now page at about half speed and devour all of that. He often said that, that he picked up things in the air. He was learned in dialogue. But he's a very humble man. He never liked me to sit next to him at meals because I would try to pick his brains. And he hated to be the center of attention. If I would ask him like a question, he was embarrassed about it, and he wouldn't sit there and expound on his theology. He would just, try to brush me off and not deal with it. When I was in his room, it was wonderful. I remember the very first time I met him, he had said, can't talk long and no English, So we were in there, and after about 20 minutes, trying to be respectful of his time, I said, "Pater, that's enough, maybe." And he says, "No, you stay. You talk longer." And he got mellower and mellower, and after an hour and 20 minutes, and telling me quite personal things and so on, he got up and he put his arm around me and he said, "Pray for my happy death." That's a very odd thing to say, I suppose, unless you're on your deathbed or something. But pray for my happy death. He was often preoccupied with thoughts of death and struggled with all of that. And he was very warm and welcoming to me and so on. So I have fond memories of him, and I would, when I left Rahner in Munich the last time, I told him that I wanted to thank him for allowing me to and enabling me to remain a Catholic Christian priest with intellectual honesty, allowing me to carry on my pastoral ministry without what I considered intellectual pretense, without embarrassment, without fear of dialogue with atheistic professors or sociologists or psychologists. I thanked him for enabling me to stay in this faith in a way that seemed reasonable to me, that was acceptable, that didn't require me to set aside intelligence. So Rahner extremely influential on me. This is one vote I won in the when we built this church, was to have him on the wall back there. That was I usually lost the votes in the committee, but that's one that I actually won. So we got Uncle Carl back there on the wall, so all these young students can come in here and see one of the 4 or 5 most influential theologians in the whole history of the church. Well, one of the reasons he's influential, and the way, why you say, why are theologians influential, or what? The ones who are influential build what we call new paradigms of theology. They figure out a new way to speak about what Jesus is all about. And that way has a coherence to it and a universality. And when people hear it, they say something like, "That makes sense." And then what happens is other thinkers say, "Yeah, that's right," and they join the group. And before long, you've got a movement or a large group of people who keep alive that key insight of the great thinkers. So they produce a new constellation in theology, a new way of putting it all together, a new way of understanding. That's only happened, I think, a handful of times in the history of Christianity. I listed, I think, somewhere in these notes, if that didn't get excised, of people who have done that, come up with new. I mean, in the New Testament, I think Paul did that, and John did that, and Origen certainly did it, as a great Eastern father, Augustine, Aquinas, Luther, for sure, other people. And out of all of that, I believe that Rahner is one who produced a new paradigm, a new way of understanding the faith, a new way of collecting the data, of organizing it, of understanding the main theological themes. So that's one of the reasons that he is important. Now, he would not be known the way he is except for the Second Vatican Council, I think. It's an interesting confluence of events. So he's doing all this background work in the 30s and 40s and 50s before the council is called. He's got this great body of material already. He's appointed by Pope John the 23rd as a peritus, an expert at the council. He's in there giving talks to all the bishops. He's writing drafts of the documents. He has personal relationships with the German bishops so he can get the ideas into the mix. And in turn, after influencing the council then spreads these ideas in a way that could never happen through most of our history. Also, that all that stuff is filtered down to us. It's come to us. Some of us began to learn it in pages of America Magazine. Charles Davis used to write articles building on Rahner's thought. And Gregory Baum wrote a book called Man Becoming. And then it worked its way into the religious education movement, especially through Gabriel Moran. who I also studied with and served as his assistant at Manhattan College for a while. So that all of that, you can see, begins a filtering process where the genius influences others. He influences seminary professors and people who go to conferences in the summer, and people who take classes, lay people who take classes, and then it gets into the homilies that are preached at the masses, and then before long it's in RCIA programs, and it all filters down, often anonymously, without anyone knowing. I've taught Rahner in all kind of situations, in Protestant seminaries and in Catholic settings, and Fordham or Notre Dame or Marist College, all over. And sometimes when I teach Rahner, people say, "Oh, yeah, that's where it came from." In other words, it's very affirming. They say, "Oh, yeah, that's what I thought." Or "That's how I've always seen it," or "That's how I learned it," or "That's what I've come to see." Oh, that's where it comes from. Oh, now I see what the basis for it is. Now I see the coherence of it all. That's one thing that happens very often in teaching Rahner to people. So he's influenced us in many ways, and many of the themes of the council have become part of our outlook. So if I meet somebody who says, "Well, we are the church," oh, yeah, there's the influence of Rahner. If somebody says, as lay people, we have to interact in a good basis with the priests. I mean, we can't just be passive with the priests. We got to have our own way. Say, there's the influence of Rahner. When people say that, "Well, I think that Buddhists can get to heaven," I see the hand of Rahner in all of that. When people say, "Boy, I love these ecumenical dialogues or interfaith, we did Christian-Muslim dialogue, and I learned something, and boy, the Quran's interesting," and so I say, there's the influence of Rahner in one way or another. When people say, "I like the way we do the liturgy now. Liturgy is more meaningful to me. I feel like I'm included. I feel like I'm participating, and that's really important to me," and we say, "Aha, this is the influence of Rahner." So it's filtered down in many ways. Now, we have people, now to move into the critics. That's going to shape what I have to say here. So there are some people, I think, who don't like any of those changes of Vatican II. I might call them, for my purposes tonight, Catholic fundamentalists. They're really not happy with the idea that maybe Buddhists are getting to heaven. I mean, this is not a happy thought. Not after I fasted every Lent for years. Not after I went to Mass every Sunday, and sometimes at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there's these other people, others, who haven't done any of that, and they're getting to heaven. Something is essentially wrong with this. There's people who feel like their security was taken away, that all these changes undermine something that was important. It was all clear, it was all set, it was all fixed, and it was a home. The church was the home, the parish was the home, and you could be Catholic wherever you went in the world. It was the same. Mass was the same. And it was all homogeneous. It was all felt right. It gave me stability. Stability. I was rooted. Knew who I was and where we fit. We knew how you related to priests and nuns. And we knew that the Pope ran it, and we were going to follow it, and didn't have to think a whole lot about it. And that's gone. It's an attack. It's an attack on what I held dear, what was important to me, and it makes me feel insecure. I understand that. Somebody was telling me the other day, a young priest was saying, they're trying to help me understand some young priests who are very rigid in their outlooks, and they don't like a lot of these changes. And he linked it for me to the question of stability. A lot of lights went on when I heard that. He said, a lot of these guys, I know them, they come from broken families. All they've known is instability throughout their lives. It's not like you older ones who usually came from stable families as priests and grew up in that and then needed to spread our wings, needed to find a way to expand what we were all about and to find new ways. Just the opposite. Here's people who lived in chaos growing up and in their lives, and everything's changing. Society's changing. Institutions change. Everything's out of whack. I got to find something stable. And here it comes. In the church, that's where I'm going to find this stability. So there's people like this who are just terribly upset. And, well, they think somehow that there's somebody behind this. Somebody has messed this up. They probably don't know who it was, but somebody's the cause of this thing. And it's probably dissenting theologians. They're as good a target as any. I mean, I gave a talk not long ago, and the first question had nothing to do with, it was all a very popular, upbeat talk, and the first question was, well, why do you have all those dissenting theologians as speakers at Corpus Christi? They thought I was from Texas or something. No, and I said, I tried to get a feel for the question, but it comes out of that hurt. What messed it all up are these dissenting theologians, and if you find the one who's most influential of all, then well, you go after Rahner. I mean, if you ever heard his name, he'd be a good one to say the dissenting theologians have given us all of this difficulty. Well, that's the way that comes out, I would say, at some sort of popular level. And it comes out often among fundamentalists as being aggressive. Like, we got to stop this. This is a terrible thing that has happened. And we've got to get our church back. We heard that when Father Richard Vasco lectured in here, and there were people who now have latched on to, well, the problem is church architecture. They wreck our churches. Renovation it becomes recovation. They're messing it all up, and Father Richard Vasco becomes the lightning rod for that man who helped design this church here. So you begin to see they latch on to things because they shatter their sense of life and the uniformity, homogeneity of the Catholic faith. So I mean, I like to have empathy for this. I mean, I know I was glib when I first started that, but I like to have empathy for this. I mean, these are people who are hurting. You can see it in their faces and in their diatribes that come out. So I want to be sensitive to that. But I think that their program then, what they want to do is go back in one way or another to the pre-modern world, is simply not going to work. I mean, you can't take these collegians that I teach, they're in my contemporary theology class, and try to put them down below decks of a ship again where nothing's moving. You can't do it. They watch MTV. You just can't go back to a pre-modern world. It's impossible because there's multiple perspectives. There's quick cuts. There's relativity. It's all in the air. Can't go back in that way, I think. So I want to fight that one. When I look at that, and there are theologians. I got a guy here, Charles James. He just finished his a degree and took on Rahner. Well, didn't even get his doctorate, I might say, but he felt the need to take on a giant. And they published it in the New Oxford Review. I sort of summarized some of that there, that Rahner is responsible for relativizing all the truth. That you can't have these clear truth claims. You can't have these clear teachings because Rahner has, in one way or another, has relativized all this. Therefore, you devalue or jettison Catholic doctrine. That's what to blame Rahner for all of that. Well, all of that doesn't hold water if you know anything about Karl Rahner. I mean, it just isn't like that. Rahner was one who took all of the church doctrines and wanted to keep them and always show their relevance for our time. He wanted to show how we needed to mine the riches of those doctrines and to understand how they would have existential impact on us in our daily lives. He didn't want to get rid of them. He didn't want to relativize them. He wanted to interpret them in a way that would make sense for people today. And this guy wants to claim that, well, the problem with Rahner is that he doesn't understand history, that he doesn't understand that we meet God in history. Well, you would have to have missed some really important books of Rahner. One of the most important books he wrote is called Hearers of the Word. And the whole essential argument of the book is that the only way that one can hear the Word of the Lord is in human history. It's only in history, it's only in our own experience, in the concrete world, that we will meet God. That's an extremely important part of Rahner's whole outlook. And we now have, what these people again don't like is other people are going to get saved. Other people are going to be saved. That's very dispiriting, it's very hard to take, especially when we've put so much effort into being a really good Catholic. Well, one of the things we do have to say is that Rahner's ideas did influence the council, and it became part of our conciliar teaching. And we Catholics now are on official record in a number of documents in Vatican II, Lumen Gentium document of the Church, Article 16 being the prime witness to that we do believe that people who follow their conscience can be saved. God does not deny His grace of salvation, even to those who have not yet learned to call Him by name, if they follow their conscience. God does not deny the grace of salvation, even to atheists. Let alone the Buddhists and the Hindus and the Muslims and the Jews, even the atheists can be saved, according to the Second Vatican Council. Now, one could be mad at the Council, but Rahner's views have prevailed in that setting. So we can't go back. I want to fight that one. I want to fight against the Catholic fundamentalists out, not the persons, because I think they're hurting. And they feel under attack by the modern world, and that's a terrible position to be. It's a very bad situation to be, like Nietzsche said, floating around in space and not knowing up from down, and the earth is unchained from the sun. That's not pleasant, and I know that. But the answer is not to go back to the pre-modern world, not back to the pre-Vatican II Church. Now, we take up another outlook here, and that's from the neoconservatives. That's a sort of triumvirate of George Weigel, Richard Newhouse, and Michael Novak. We've had both. George has been here to talk, and so has Michael, and many times. Friends of mine. And but Weigel really did take Rahner on, and Weigel, in a fairly recent article, and I mentioned where it comes from here, but Weigel ends up saying that Rahner's out of date. The next century will not be Rahnerian theologically. And his fundamental point is that, well, he wrote for German academics, and nobody else can understand him. Nobody else can understand him. And his descriptions of the human scene don't resonate with anybody that George Weigel knows. And Rahner's questions are questions that none of his friends ask. I will read something to you. This is a fundamental answer to that objection. It's from Rahner's Meditations and Prayers. We are all pilgrims on the wearisome roads of our life. There's always something ahead of us that we have not yet overtaken. When we do catch up with something, it immediately becomes an injunction to leave it. behind us and to go onwards. Every end becomes a beginning. There is no resting place or abiding city. Every answer is a new question. Every good fortune is a new longing. Every victory is only the beginning of a defeat. Aren't we always dispatching messengers from the dungeon of our compulsions and disappointments? We send them to find the real thing, that which is ultimately valid, even though we do not really know where to direct these messengers of our unassuaged longing. Isn't death, which swallows us all, the only thing that we are sure to catch up with on our way? In our strange confusion, we try to hold back the fleeting moment and to get to the next moment ahead more quickly than ever it could get to us. We who on all human pathways are always forerunners of the transient, are always tempted to elevate our plans and projects to the level of something that is to come, an ultimate that will remain forever. It seems that something of the idiocy which makes a person see everything and everyone else as transitory and in himself as ultimate, and refuse to be a mere forerunner of an incalculable future, is an almost inevitable feature of the world on its way. We are no more than predecessors. The goal of our journey seems always to remain far ahead of us, to stay beyond our power, and always to fade into new perspectives of distance, even when we think we are approaching it. As people know, I had a last conversation with Bob Anderson, and it sounded just like what Rahner said there. President Mary Jo sounded just like the way he understood himself, this God. The goal of our journey is always to remain ahead of us, stay beyond our power. And if that doesn't resonate, try this. I should like to remember my dead to you, O Lord. All those who once belonged to me have now left me. That's why my heart is now with them, with my loved ones who have taken their leave of me. There is no substitute for them. There are no others who can fill the vacancy when one of those whom I have really loved departs and is with me no more. Could a true lover ever forget the dead? The quiet and composure that we gradually regain are not a sign that things are as they were before, but a proof that his gift is ultimate and definitive. It shows that a piece of our own heart has really died and is now with the living dead. This is the real reason we weep no more. They have gone away. They are silent. Not a word comes through from them. Not a single sign of their gentle love and kindness comes to warm my heart. George Weigel says Rahner's descriptions of the human scene do not resonate with people. Next, take on the criticism of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Is my friend Dave Nuss here? We got a Rahnerian expert in our city. A Balthasarian. He's not here, Dave. It's too bad. I would have given him a couple minutes to respond to my critique. Anyway, background. Karl Rahner's a Jesuit. Hans Urs von Balthasar, born 1 year later. They're fellow Jesuits. They're both brilliant. They decide to collaborate in doing theology. They work out this big plan, big overarching plan of how they're going to show the relevance of Christian doctrine to our own age. Balthasar, I think partly through his study of the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth, began to question the project. And he broke with Rahner. And he left the Jesuits. He founded his own kind of community in Basel, Switzerland, where he was a chaplain, like a campus minister to the students. And he began to go in his own direction in doing theology. And he decided that the theologians up till now had spent too much time talking about truth, seeking truth, and too much emphasis on trying to figure out how we are to be good, and that we have neglected the beautiful. And that beauty would be the entree into understanding what the Christian faith is all about. Now, as he was going along with this project, he felt the need to attack Rahner. Did so rather viciously at first, I must say, which he later tried to modify. And essentially, the attack is that Rahner's method of correlation, that is, of trying to show how Christian doctrines are relevant to people today, to try to take seriously human experience as part of doing theology, of trying to relate what the Bible says to the questions that are in our heart, that project is essentially flawed and it won't work. And that if we do it, we Catholics do it, we will end up like liberal Protestants ended up, having lost the real bite of the gospel, the real sense of transcendence, the real doctrinal heritage. We will have lost that. And Baldassar said that Rahner, by searching the human heart, ends up in sort of a subjectivism. And he misses the concrete message of the gospel, the concrete story of Jesus, and in all of its particularity. So he said Rahner has taken us astray. Well, he's produced a subjectivism. He's played down the importance of the concrete figure of Jesus and of the doctrinal heritage of the church, and that this is a problem. Well, later on, he modified some of that harsh criticism. He saw his own work as really complementary to what Rahner was doing and what others were doing. A lot of Balthasarians. Now, Hans Urs von Balthasar is a giant. I love to read his stuff. He is just intellectually powerful. He's got these volumes and volumes. They're still coming out. He was prolific. He knew all of Mozart's scores by heart. He threw out the scores, the musical scores. He was a great, he was a concert-level pianist. I think he's the most erudite man of the 20th century that I can think of. He had a marvelous command of the tradition, understood things. I mean, I read stuff that he writes, and then, my heavens, how he can penetrate to the essence of a point. So in no way, want to put down Hans Urs von Balthasar, and we're going to hear more of him as time goes on. And we got priests studying his theology in depth and getting their degrees on it, and they're going to be influential in the Diocese of Toledo. So Balthasar will become much more influential in our own area as time goes on. A lot of the Balthasarians are sort of content to let us Rahnerians go and say, well, we got our own project. We want to center on beauty and the glory of God manifested through Jesus, especially in his death, and they want to let us go. But some of them don't. We had one here, Robert Barron. He wanted to pick a fight. Told me that. I want to pick a fight, and we had a public fight, and it's published. Different Balthasarian approach to the priesthood, or Rahnerian approach to the priesthood, and he picked a fight. Wanted to challenge the way the Rahner understands the priesthood and so on, and he wanted to challenge it because he thinks that the whole Rahnerian project led to what he calls a beige Catholicism. Beige. No color. All you older guys, you grew up with that, boy, no meat on Friday and that, and you had nuns who picked you up bodily and threw you against the blackboard, and you had priests who were colorful people, and they wore collars, and you knew they were priests, and the nuns were in habits, and you fasted after midnight, and everyone knew that, and it was a colorful, wonderful Catholic world, a whole world of Catholic ethnicity that we know. Oh, and now, I didn't have that. Robert Barron says, younger theologian, my world was bland. We went to school and made collages, and the nuns didn't wear habits, and there was nothing distinctive about it. He says, I want an in-your-face Catholicism. He wants to resurrect the toughness of it all, the distinctiveness of it all. That's very Balthasarian. I want the distinctiveness. You got too much of this ecumenical dialogue, too much of this getting along, too much of this watering it down. I want an in-your-face Catholicism. I want to go back and get the distinctiveness out. And a big part of that is the charge that Rahner isn't into the form of Jesus. He isn't enough on the concrete, historical Jesus. That this is what is causing our problems. Let me now try to... I mean, the fundamental response about all of this is that I think it isn't right. It's not fair. If you read one book of Rahner, The Foundations of Christian Faith, and that's what some of these people do, and he doesn't say a lot about the historical Jesus, he isn't talking about the woman at the well, and he's not talking about raising Lazarus, and he's not got a lot in there. That's true. But he wrote a few other books, like hundreds of them, where he talks all about Jesus and what Jesus is like, what he's all about. Here's a little one, Prayers for a Lifetime. Lord Jesus Christ, we worship you, true God and true man in one person. That's for the ones who think he denies the divinity. You have shared everything with us. You know it, this our life. You've experienced it and lived it to the full. You have felt what it's like to have a body, the flesh of sin and death, what it's like to be captive in the limitations imposed by the forces of this world, hunger, death, politics, folly, wretchedness, traditions, laws, all of which are our masters. The obligation to earn one's bread, our involvement in the world around us and in social positions not of our choosing. You were a man. Therefore, it must be a meaningful, splendid, and happy thing to be a human. Because of you and your human life, we believe this. That's extremely telling, the last point. What many of these critics of Rahner says is that his philosophy overrides his theology, that he figures out what we're really like, what we human beings are all about, what makes us tick, what we long for, our joys, the source of our sorrows, and that's what governs all of his thought. That's why the last line is really, we know all of this because of you and your human life. In other words, it's a signal that for him, Christ is model for us. That it's because of Christ that we understand so much of human existence. He is the fullness of human life. And so for Rahner, the doctrines of the church help us to see things we would miss. So he says the doctrine of the Trinity reminds us that we are relational creatures. Reminds us that we are intersubjective, that we are interdependent, that we come to know who we are only in and through others. And so there is this... I could just take book after book and show you how Rahner will talk about the concreteness of all of this. And where I think it really becomes simply wrong to say that he has not kept up with all of this. Now I can try to give more arguments to do this, but I think that it really gets down to the fact that if you read it all, you just can't believe that Rahner has given us a bland Catholicism. I mean, does that sound bland? No, that he's given us a beige Catholicism. I just don't think that. Rahner had a great feel for the traditions of the church, for all the ways the Spirit percolates up. It's very concrete, this Rahnerian theology, and the charge is constantly that it isn't. That it's this sort of what they call transcendental philosophy, this analysis of human nature that governs all of the work. Now, I believe there's dangers in the Balthasar. Dangers. I can tell you one thing. I mean, Balthasar is responsible for the argument that it's impossible for women to be ordained. Not just that we shouldn't do it, but it's impossible. We call it the iconic argument. I could probably get into graphic detail on that anatomically, but women cannot be ordained. It's impossible because they can't represent Jesus, who was male, in relationship to the church, which is bride, which is spouse. That's an argument that is difficult, but I can tell you this, the stronger the Balthasarian theology becomes, the more likely that you get strong arguments against the ordination of women. And Balthasar wanted to center on, this life of the church and the whole Catholic thing, and I think it makes it harder really to enter into ecumenical dialogue or interfaith dialogue, harder to see other religious traditions as having as being vehicles of the truth and of beauty and goodness for us. And I remember one seminary asked me to come, the Rahnerians asked me to come and speak because they felt outnumbered by the Balthasarians. And one of their worries was that the Balthasarians kept talking about the priest as being very elite and being above, and the ordained priesthood as being very, 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 very different from the universal priesthood. And all kind of language like that would produce priests perhaps that didn't have a whole lot of feel for the commonness of the clergy-lay situation and interaction. I don't want to be too harsh on that, and I'm open to criticism myself on that critique. But I would tell you that something I've said to the Balthasarians. I do fear this, that people trained in that way, priests trained in that way, do not learn the method of correlation. Get up and give homilies, they're not trained to make the connections. Like, well, what does that mean for everyday life? What does that mean for married people? What does it mean for single people? What does it mean for the work site? Not trained that way. Now, if you get a really bright Balthasarian who's getting up and preaching, I think we got a gem. But not all that priests are that bright or creative. No. And I mean, I've said this publicly in other settings, and to Balthasarians, I fear that if you're trained that way, and that becomes a dominant way of training priests, the quality of homilies will go down. Because they won't know how to make these explicit connections. I mean, what does it mean to say Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I love to read Balthasar. Oh, I'm not watching the time well at all here. I love to read Balthasar, and it's just great, and it's intellectually challenging and enriching. At the end of it, it's pretty easy to say, well, now, so what? What does that mean? Or how would I ever use that in a homily? I do use his stuff in homilies, I must say. And he's got a great little book out on Sunday commentaries and Sunday readings. But it takes the next step to figure out what it might mean for people. I really have not managed time well. Next, liberationist critique of Rahner. When Rahner wrote that introduction to my book, Apologetics and the Eclipse of Mystery, he said something like, the only criticism I take really seriously comes from the liberationists, political theologians. And I told him, I said, Pater, that sounds arrogant. He says, that's what I mean. So the liberationists, that is like feminist theologians, liberation theologians like Gutierrez in Latin America, black theologians, they have big criticism of Rahner. And that is that when he looks at the human person, he does not situate them enough in the political, economic, and social setting where they belong. He doesn't take gender enough into account. And Rahner's answer to that is, they're right. I didn't do enough of that. But his further answer is, but my system is open to it. There's no reason why we can't incorporate all these wonderful analysis of the way women's experience is not respected, the way their experience has been erased from history. There's no reason why we can't think more concretely about people living in Latin America in substandard conditions. All of that we need. We have to have it. Gutierrez, one of the great insights of the 20th century, he studied this Rahnerian type theology. Came back to Lima, Peru, and tried to preach it, and it didn't work. Didn't work for a lot of people, but he figured out why. Rahner wrote for non-believers. He wrote for secularized people. He tried to say, how do you talk to people who are taken with the modern world, enlightenment, rationality, science? That's who he was writing for. And Gutierrez says, those aren't the people I'm preaching to. They're not non-believers. They believe in their hearts and their guts. The problem is they're treated like non-persons. It's one of the great seminal insights of the 20th century, picked up by women theologians, Asian theologians, African, all over the world. You got to think, put into dialogue with the people on the margins, or the people who die of no account. Absolutely critical to the whole process. And that becomes an enrichment. So you can go two ways with this. You can say Rahner really is open to this and needs the criticism, and we welcome it. Certainly the way I look at it. I try to read that stuff and use it, and all the stuff on social sin and political theology. I think it's great. We need more of it. We need a church who reaches out to the poor. Rahner's not the best guide in that, but I think his theology is open to it. On the other hand, liberation movement is, well, I might say one other thing that I've only become aware of in the last year. Rahner's extremely influential on the liberation theologians. Maybe Rick Gallardi will help me with this someday, but it's through a fellow named Elucuria, is it? Yeah. I didn't understand any of that at first, and I'm just learning it, but he's more influential than I ever thought on Latin American liberation theologians. But I want to have the movement. I don't need to make Rosemary Ruther into a Rahnerian. You know, I'm not interested in Gutierrez, who we're trying to get to come here and give a talk. Great seminal thinker and all this. I'm not interested in showing he's a Rahnerian. I want to have their own movement. Multiple perspectives, just like I like to have the Baldazarians. I don't like it when they tell me I'm giving a bland Catholicism, but I like to have them. They're useful. It's great to look at the old Christian tradition from the viewpoint of beauty. It's also wonderful to realize you got a dialogue with non-persons and the people on the margins. Very valuable thing. Oh, what will I do now? I have three major things here. What I will do is skip the post-liberals. That comes out of the Protestant world largely. George Lindbeck teaches at Yale. Some of the same criticisms. I'm going to let that go. And then we got radical orthodoxy. That's connected with a man who's getting all kind of publicity. You might have read about him in Time magazine. They're playing him up as the great theological guru of our time, John Milbank. Anglican, and he takes Rahner on in no uncertain terms. I think he doesn't understand Rahner and isn't fair to him. Let me go to the last one then. And this is a criticism from the postmoderns, David Tracy especially. I have the utmost respect for David Tracy. He's the most brilliant Catholic theologian in the world right now, I believe. Been writing a book on God for 10 years. I've got chapters of it that are extremely influential in my own thinking and so on. He's just wonderful. And Tracy, of course, loves Rahner and says Rahner's made a contribution that we got to hang on to. He'd be very much in tune with what I've been saying, that we're going to be in big trouble if we lose Rahner, because then you're going to get a more clericalized church, and you're going to want to send Protestants to hell, and bad things are going to happen. if we don't hang on to Rahner and keep his thought. But the world has changed. We're now in a new postmodern situation. Somebody might remember I wrote a book on this, Spirituality in Transition, where I tried to detail that shift from the modern world to postmodern world. I think that has happened. The world is different. These young students I teach see the world differently than I do. It's just a new world. If you grow up with television, computers, the internet, it shapes one's consciousness. You begin to think in different ways. So Tracy says in this new world, theology has to take all of that seriously. And he's got a couple major things he wants to do. Get our minds off ourselves. I think he's worried that Rahner's theology will make us too self-preoccupied, too interior, too worried about ourselves. He wants us to get our minds on the other. The other is his big category. The other, those are like people, different colored skin, from different cultures, people on the margins, people that we don't understand, people of a different sexual orientation. It's the other that he wants us to listen to. All the voices that have been erased, all the people whose experience has been of no account. He wants to hear all the non-persons speak out. The other is what we need to be in touch with. And the other thing he wants to do is to talk about God in less grandiose ways, they've got to remember that God is the incomprehensible one, that God is hidden. You can't prove God's existence by persuasion or argument. And he wants us to be very in touch with experiences of what he calls the void, the terror of life, the really radical alienation, the feeling like that a trapdoor opened and we fall into the abyss, that the stability is gone that we hope for, the extreme suffering, torture of political prisoners, the void, experiences of the void. Out of the depths I cry to thee, O Lord. And the experience of what he calls the open. Those are experiences of awe and wonder, of the beauty of life, of the simplicity of a good conversation, of the times when we feel okay with ourselves and our surroundings, when we realize that all of life is a gift from the great God. And so my response as a Rahnerian to this is, thank goodness for David Tracy. One of the first things Rahner said to me when I met him is, don't become a disciple. Do not become a disciple of mine. Go and try to do creatively in your own setting what I tried to do in mine. Don't be a disciple. And so it says the same thing as the theology moves forward. There's always new questions. Can't raise Rahner up as having the answer to every problem that ever came up. He's limited, finite. So I say to Tracy, I can't wait till your book comes out. And that the new ways of approaching theology will enrich us all. We'll find new dialogue partners. We'll learn from those people who we call the deconstructionists. We have things to learn from them. And so, but I believe that Rahner is a classic achievement, that what he gave us is a permanent contribution to the church. It's wonderful stuff. It's inspiring and enriching. It's helped many of us to make sense out of our faith. Elements of the modern world will continue into the next century. We're not suddenly all going to become postmoderns. Modernity will be part of our outlook, the way we've seen the world. We'll all be shaped by it, even the young people. They won't get away from it. And Rahner will always have an enduring validity. And we want to stand on it, not for speculative reasons. I want to hang on to him so that we can have an open debate on whether women should be ordained. Well, I want to hang on to him so I got a support for going into Christian-Muslim dialogue and assured that that's a good thing to do. I want to hang on to him so I can keep encouraging lay people to get involved in his church and be co-responsible for it. I want to hang on to him so we can enter into the world as it is and find our ways to try to transform it and make it a better place. And so I want to say thanks once again to Carl Rahner, as I said the last time I left him. Pater Rahner, I thank you for your contribution to the church. And on this day, close to the anniversary of your death, I pray that God will keep your spirit alive in our church. Amen. Thank you, and again, thanks for the prayers. We will take a 2-minute stand-up break and then have opportunity for comments and questions ending no later than 7 p.m. And we'll thank Rahner, too. You got notes. All right, can I have your attention, please? Forgot to tell people it's going to be hard to get out of the parking lot, I know. I think we got the red light switched. All right, let's see if we have, we got phones as always. I believe I see Scott Woods in the back. Cheryl, thanks. See if somebody wants to direct me. We got. It's not on. Fix. We got a question over here. We'll get straightened out. Are switches not?
Could you pass modern and postmodern thought?
Yes. Say I wrote quite a segment, long set of my book, Spirituality and Position, on that. I mean, essentially, and crucial, the argument, I'm glad I brought it up and specified. I mean, the modern world was created by the age of discovery, Columbus, created by a new way of approaching science, by Bacon. It was created by the invention of the printing press. It was featured the Enlightenment. The idea of the philosophers, well, reason will help make the world better. Reason and science together is what will give us human progress. Part of that often was, and the European Enlightenment was, that the church is in the way. So Voltaire said, smash infamous thing. That was the church. Smash the infamous thing so that reason and modern approach, science, all of that can help make the world a better place. So modernity means that whole complex of things that we know in the world. I mean, the modern world is characterized by science, go to the moon, and we get diseases. And it was characterized by colonialism. The major powers controlled things. No, it was patriarchal. Men ran the modern world. No, modern was created a new Cold War, U.S. versus Soviet Union. The modern world, electronic. My students process information a different way than I do. I make lines, like we tonight, in a linear fashion. That's how my mind goes. They think in collage. They think in image. They process information in a different way. So that's all of the modern world. But what has happened, as we see, is humanity is breaking up. They don't know where it's going. Everything you think of, except the electronic area where the shape is pretty clear, the internet, computers, all of that. You either adjust, as the students told me, they're going to put on my tombstone, he never adapted. Well, just never made it. A Neanderthal. Never made it. But what is happening is that modern world is breaking down in every way you can think of it. The Cold War is over. Now we're trying, how do you function as a lone superpower? Colonial world is over. That's what creates this Christian-Muslim problem. I mean, that's our making. I mean, Kuwait, it's our making. Then we think we have to go and fight a war about it. But that era of colonialism where the certain European powers, the United States, ran things, well, that's gone. But what's the post-colonial world look like? A lot of people don't like the patriarchal world. The men running everything. But what does a post-patriarchal world look like? How do men and women relate on a new basis? What does a partnership in marriage really look like? So we're in process of trying to figure out all of those things. And the world is, in that sense, is post-enlightenment. There's just many ways. We see reason doesn't solve it. Reason, intelligence, science, it creates nuclear weapons. We could blow ourselves up. It creates pollution. So reason and science are not just unmixed goods. And then we get Hitler had a rational solution to the problem. The death camps, the Holocaust, the rationality of it was horrible. Eichmann, all of that. Final solution, there's all records kept, it's all rational, clear. It's horrible. So that we now can't be as optimistic that reason and science will straighten everything out. So we are post-enlightenment, but how do you use reason? So that's the breakup. And so I like the word postmodern precisely because it doesn't mean anything. Nobody knows what postmodern means. You got postmodern architecture, it's got one frame of reference, but I like the word postmodern because it highlights the fact that the new world is being created. So I try to tell young people who might want to be a priest, nobody knows how you're supposed to be a priest today. And we're trying to figure it out. So I said, why don't you come and join us and help figure it out? Create it. Create the new priesthood that we're going to have. So you can look at it positively, exciting, but it just isn't clear to us. So we live with that instability, but I like to see it as creative. We live with a great opportunity to shape the new world. As Dr. Gallardi points out over and over, that the world of technology we've created is a mixed blessing. In some ways it can be dehumanizing. At the same time it saves us time so we can go do something else, like read Rahner. So, extremely important question. But Tracy, I think the postmodern world's got some contours to it, as I was suggesting to him. Yeah, David, you get your chance. Get David a microphone, Cheryl.
Nothing's working. My question was he influenced by Teilhard, or did he have thoughts on Teilhard?
It's very interesting. Great questions asked about the relationship with Teilhard de Chardin, another great Jesuit who died before Rahner and was older. I once asked Rahner that. It was comical. I mean, Rahner said to me sort of as an aside so no one would hear it, "Tell you the truth, I haven't read much of them." Quote from Carl. But, then he went on to say, but his thought is in the air. But his thought is in the air. And so, as a matter of fact, when you see in Rahner's Foundations of Christian Faith, and you get to the part on Christ, he talks, sounds an awful lot like Teilhard de Chardin. An awful lot like, he'll talk about the fact that matter is frozen spirit, and that matter is got an inner drive to become more spiritualized. He talks about the evolutionary character of our world, and we have to understand Jesus in terms of evolution. So Rahner, sort of an overplay, tell you the truth, I haven't read him, but he knew his thought. He was influenced by him, but you got to remember, Rahner was a professional theologian, Teilhard de Chardin was not. Teilhard was a paleontologist, a geologist, trained in the sciences, and he wrote this wonderful little stuff about theology that sort of touches our imagination and sets people off in a lot of different directions. Teilhard is not in these days. You don't read a lot of books about him and published new material on him as he was at one time. And there's a great contrast between the two. And in terms of their piety, Teilhard had long periods of depression. I mean, Teilhard was, he knew, and he was never allowed to publish his works, and it was a terrible cross for him, and he didn't get criticism, and it just hurt him. He went into months of depression and all of that. But his piety was what I would call a springtime piety. He thought that everything in the world was working for the good. And World War I was just, a little understandable friction as nations come into contact with one another. Just a little altercation, very expected, as nations come closer together. See, they thought everything was converging, everything getting more united. And so as nations became closer and more, they'll fight a little bit, so we ended up with World War I. That's a Teilhardian springtime piety. Rahner, on the other hand, as his appearance suggests, had a wintry piety. Rahner saw the dark side of life, the cross, the heaviness of life. He thought that the mixture of good and evil in the world was relatively constant. How could you think otherwise if you lived in Germany during the Holocaust? The idea of Teilhard that the world was getting better and better, and the kingdom's getting more and more powerful, and the end time, the parousia, would be everything was got in order and unified and beautiful and wonderful, and the parousia, the end time, God's last judgment, would sort of be like, boop, one little final step. For Rahner, the world is a constant mix of sin and evil along with grace and divine blessing. And that struggle goes on through all of history, and it's just part of the 20th century as much as it was the century. I promised over here. Got to wait. Is driven from Cincinnati to be here. Did you come from Cincinnati?
Yeah, we just.
Yes. It's a chance to talk.
In historical study and in European history right now, there's a real attack on her, and there's a deep emphasis of Heidegger, and particularly of the that say that they had a really hard. That there's an inherent phantom in Heidegger. There's a recent book Heidegger's out that takes on a rant of those other people, and it was obviously at least influenced by her. How would you respond to some of the criticisms that are being laid on at Heidegger students, and that there's just something in that mental attack that Heidegger makes, and that there's an anti-modernism and anti-liberalism that sort of laid the way for things like Nazism? Does Rahner pick up those, or is he better because of other things to move beyond that?
Well, you're into it right, David, I think. First of all, the relation between Rahner and Heidegger, I know about that as well. And he said, did Heidegger ever write about Christ? Did Heidegger ever write sacraments? No. Well then. He was, one might say, defensive about it. And of course, it's all part of this, Heidegger's support, however you sort that out, of Nazism. and Heidegger being out in that way and looked down upon. Rahner obviously wanted to distance himself from Heidegger, but on another occasion, and I think I read this as well as hearing it from him, that, no, maybe he told me himself, he said somebody came up to me and said, I saw Heidegger going to church, and he genuflected. And Rahner said, that would surprise you only if you don't understand Heidegger. So he studied under Heidegger. He was the note taker in his seminar, which was a very privileged position in Heidegger seminars. If you were picked to be that, you were the ace student, and that was Rahner's job. And he was very influenced. Heidegger began his thinking with the notion, man questions. The human being questions, and that's very much part of Rahner's outlook. So he was influenced by Heidegger while he denied it. I'll tell you another way, at the starting point he was influenced. Human beings question. We are infinite searchers with finite capabilities, right, Katie? We're infinite searchers with finite capabilities. Very Rahnerian, very Heideggerian as well. So Rahner gets that from him. And the other thing is Heidegger was big on death. He says we're all beings moving towards death. Death sets a boundary. And that's what gives meaning to all of the events of our lives. That we are moving towards that death, and we know there is not an unlimited number of tomorrows. We know our loved ones will die someday. And that sets up obligation and responsibility to make the most of whatever happens before that boundary is met, both personally and in dealing with others. Rahner picked that up very clearly. But I think I see nothing in Rahner that would indicate this sort of fascist idea or Nazi idea. Rahner hated all of that. He was himself dismissed from his teaching post by the Nazis. Where Heidegger was favored by the Nazis, Rahner was dismissed. So right away there was seen to be a big difference. And Rahner hated all that stood for. And I think your intuition again is right, is that it was his larger Christian perspective that kept him from falling into any trap like that, where the dignity of the human person and the relativity of every structure, every governmental structure. You couldn't have a Hitler in a Rahnerian world. I mean, you just couldn't have that. That's too absolute. That's too much absolute power. Now, that's not to say Rahner was perfect in challenging all of that. It's one of the criticisms of Johann Metz, of his teacher, Rahner, that Rahner did not understand that it was the German bishops who should have challenged Heidegger. I mean, challenged Hitler. It was the German bishops. Hitler feared the German bishops. That's known now. And they didn't use their power to go against him. And Rahner always thought that was the job of Christians banding together in small groups to fight Hitler. Whereas disciple Metz said, no, you've missed the institutional side of this thing. That the only way to have stopped Hitler was not little groups of Christians to fight him, but was to get the German bishops, and probably by extension the Pope, to have taken him on, and to try to put a stop to what was going on. Dr. Gallardi, yes, Cheryl?
Father Bachik, you mentioned George Weigel, and I was wondering if George Weigel completely rejected Rahner, or did he just object to the people following him with secular motives in mind, not necessarily in mind, but the secular agenda that goes on even within the church, and calling this Rahner, Rahner theology.
Yeah.
And Weigel and also Newhouse, these guys have a sense of humor, and they actually work. I don't think there's any other group that is ecumenically as effective, whether it's cross interfaith or ecumenical.
Okay, let me try to respond to some of that. I don't usually think of them as being especially characterized by a sense of humor, but let's say one positive thing about George Weigel. He loves the Toledo Mud Hens. He'll probably come for the opening of the new stadium, I think. Anyway, he's a great baseball fan, and when he was here, he wanted all the Mud Hen paraphernalia he could find. And George is a good guy, and I mean, when he was writing the book on the Pope, he published a big volume on the Pope, and he was in Czechoslovakia with all that. He called me up and talked about it and so on. So I mean, I like him as a person and so on. But that whole group has not developed a theology. I mean, they got a social ethic, and you read the stuff, and I mean, they sound like apologists for capitalism. I mean, that's one of their major points, that democratic capitalism is, the be-all, end-all, that it sort of celebrate U.S. capitalism and so on. And that's a major influence on, a major theme that comes out in their writing. So they've not developed like Christology, ecclesiology, all the normal things that theologians do. They're social ethicists, and they're very good at that, and I think they have a lot of good things to say. I think that Weigel wants to turn back the Rahnerian project. I think he wants to take it in other directions. They don't do anything haphazardly. These people are very smart, extremely intelligent, and they are very politically savvy. I mean, Newhouse had a response in the Wall Street Journal when Centesium Annonus came out by the Pope before it was released. I mean, nobody could get their hands on it, and Newhouse found out a way to do it and put a spin on it in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, these people, and they got their own journals, Crisis Magazine and First Things. I mean, these people are very smart and very politically minded. They have... Their type of people are, got Bush's ear through Dale Hudson. Dale Hudson's the Catholic, got the ear of George Bush more than anybody else. And he gets his Catholic, he's the editor of Crisis Magazine, which was founded by Michael Novak. And that's how Bush understands the Catholic world, is through the eyes of Dale Hudson. So, I mean, we're not dealing with lightweights here, and we're dealing with people who want to figure out how to make things happen. And that was not accidental, that attack on Rahner, I assure you. It's a part of a larger thing, I believe, to turn back the Rahnerian project in ways and to get their own agenda more forefront. I hope I say that with great charity, and that I could say it if George was here. Rick, yeah.
One last question about the critique that Balthasar had with Rahner. It's been my sense that, setting aside the fact that there was a Balthasar's life where he was himself critical of Rahner, and as you pointed out, he backed away, it seems to me that the conflict has been much more with the disciples of Balthasar and Rahner's writing, an attempt to turn Balthasar into a kind of systematic theological counterpoint to Rahner that doesn't honor the fact that in many ways their differences were because they were different kinds of thinkers. I mean, was the classic systematic theologian, and Balthasar's really wasn't in theology, German literature, and that they were dealing with different questions. Balthasar was very taken with distinctiveness of the Christian tradition, and his, as you pointed out, do a great deal of narrative power. You were trying to defend Rahner and saying, well, look, there are lots of here where Rahner speaks great power about the distinct of the Christian tradition. But in fairness, it seems to me, and your correction, that where Rahner spoke with the greatest narrative power about the distinctiveness of in the Christian message were in his sermons, his prayers, and meditations. Whereas in his mere systematic logical works and foundations of the Word and essays, he did not explore sort of the narrative power of the Christian tradition. So that we'll compare Balthasar with Rahner, they're comparing more systematic and not those other meditations. And that if he had integrated that narrative power into some of those more formal, systematic theological reflections, that criticism might not have been put forward as much.
Everyone heard you, Mike, and I'm glad. And that's a very telling analysis. I think it's great to affirm parts that make sense to me. I think the conflict is more between the followers than the two giants. And Robert Barron is really a perfect example. I mean, he wants to fight, and he does think that the Rahnerian theology has been destructive and hasn't done what we need to do. So, I mean, I would agree with that. And I think I would also agree that there's a lot of points in which Balthasar and Rahner would agree. And I'm ready to accept, if you read the Foundations of Christian Faith as the classic summary work, you certainly don't get that narrative power. You do get, in his other writings, saying theological investigations, is what I call the great mystagogical passages. That is, the poetic passages. You'll be reading along, and it's hard to understand, and long sentences, and you'll suddenly get kind of thing I read to you here. You'll suddenly come to, it's like, wow, where'd that come from? It's a poet speaking to me. Now, if you want to broaden out and say, narrative to include poetry, then I would, try to speak more for Rahner and say, no, there's more of that in there in the theological investigations and in the foundations than maybe first meets the eye. It's there. But there's also a methodological point of why you don't get so much of the history in the foundations. He's trying to figure out what is rock solid bottom here that nobody can argue against about Jesus. And that is that he understood himself as the bringer of the kingdom. You can argue about whether he told Peter he was the rock. You can argue about the historicity of the raising of Lazarus. You can argue all that stuff. And Rahner wanted to make sure there was such a solid basis that no matter what the biblical scholars figured out, it could not undercut the Christian message. And he absolutely bet his faith on the idea that Jesus was the one who understood himself as the bringer of the kingdom, to establish the kingdom, rock solid. So, therefore, in that book, he doesn't go into all other areas that might be somehow questioned by somebody. His dialogues with Peter, or some of the miracles, or how he told the parable of the seed. All of those that the biblical scholars go into. But I'm ready to agree, and this is a criticism not just of Balthasar, but of David Tracy as well, that in the postmodern world, what we need is the narrative. And Tracy says that's what we have to rediscover, the story. You got to rediscover the power of the story in the scriptures, in the doctrinal tradition, and in the liturgy. The way we view story and all those traditions. And that's what will help us in the future. Now, I think this is absolutely right. And my answer to that, however, is that the whole Rahnerian approach is very open to that. That it's there's no reason why one can't incorporate narrative approaches in Rahner to tell the story, to make the point. I would be part of my own approach to preaching out of a Rahnerian framework. Well, we do have to stop sometime. Remember, we got a great series here. You'll get to hear Dr. Gallardi, who made the last point. He's always incisive and clear in his thinking, and he'll be here April 30th. And Michael Crosby, yes, he was just on the east side of Toledo a few weeks ago, and is wonderful. He's a prophetic figure, Christian response to terrorism. So you could come back next week and invite some friends to come and join you. Michael's a great speaker. Yeah, I guarantee that you'll find him interesting. So we hope you come and join us for the rest of the talks. Sister Shannon Shrine will be here. Christine Shank, she just might have something to say about the ordination of women. And Donald Cousins is interviewed all over the world these days about the priesthood, so you want to catch him as well. Great series, Controversial Issues. Very good. Thank you all. And again, I want to say a personal thanks.